is a short training video to help you configure your cloud service appliance. This video will not cover all aspects of the cloud service appliance, but it's more of a getting started. So the instructions will be easy and quick. In conjunction with this training, we also have a quick start guide that you should hopefully use and follow along with. We'll make references to it at times during the training. So hopefully you've downloaded the quick start guide and actually have it available. Okay, again, the purpose of this training is to enable our clients to configure the CSA without direct assistance. So that was the point when we created this training material. It really is not overly complex, but of course, features such as mobility management and the newest form of remote control is called remote control tunnels. We're not going to bother configuring that today. We want to keep things as simple as possible. However, these are enhancements that you might choose to add to your cloud service appliance in the future. We do support mobility management with Endpoint Manager, so we can manage your iOS and your Android systems. And of course, that would communicate through the cloud service appliance. As I said, the remote control tunnel is a newer feature that just came out, and it requires a lot of additional configuration. So we'll use the legacy tools for the purposes of this training. Again, the biggest purpose here is just an introduction to the cloud service appliance and setting it up for basic usage. Now, before we get started, I do want to warn you about something. Some of you may be trying to manage devices that have the EPM agent already. Perhaps they're off network. I know a lot of us are these days, and you may have already deployed your agents. The problem is it's kind of the chicken and the egg thing. In order for the agents to receive the updated settings so that they know to use the cloud service appliance, they have to communicate with the core server to get those settings. So it's kind of, you can imagine that it's kind of how we get our hook in there. And so the one thing I want to warn you is that the clients must have the ability to communicate with the core server to get their updated settings. That means they're going to have to be on the network or VPN'd in. And when they do their next security scan, a vulnerability scan, then that's when they would get their updated settings and know that they can now start using the cloud services appliance. The problem is if they don't have network access, if you don't have VPN access and they are not readily able to bring them into the office, then it's not going to be quite as simple. One suggestion I can offer if you find yourself in that scenario, and again, this may be practical for you, it may not, is to create a self-contained agent installer, because when we go into the management console and create a self-contained agent, it will include all of those specific agent settings. To be clear, in the future, you could certainly use the self-contained agent to install the agent and allow it to communicate through the CSA on devices that are off network. Of course, there's a catch, right? They have to have local admin rights in order to use that. So one of the two need to be true. Before we continue on, they have to either have the ability to connect to your network initially to get their updated settings through VPN or just by physically being present on your network, or as an alternative, you could create a self-extracting executable of the agent that they can run. It'll reinstall the agent, but it will include the new settings and allow them to be able to communicate without direct network access. Of course, as I said, that requires local admin rights for them to be able to do that. So keep all these considerations in mind before proceeding with this. All right, with that in mind, let's just talk about what we're going to do in the training today. Quickly, I want to just quickly, obviously, talk about what the cloud service appliance is and how it functions. And then we're going to talk about making preparations to implement the CSA and then configuring it. Again, CSA is a common acronym for the cloud service appliance. When I say CSA, that's what I mean. So we're going to configure the CSA, then we're going to configure the core server, the Endpoint Manager core server, so that it knows to begin using the cloud service appliance. Then we'll edit our agent settings so that they know that they can use the cloud service appliance. And this is the part that I was mentioning previously. That's the hard part. If they do VPN in, if they are on your company network, then certainly the configuration of the agents will be automatic. If not, then we have to look at alternatives and other considerations. So let's start by just explaining what the Cloud Service Appliance is. The Cloud Service Appliance is a Linux-based appliance that's been very hardened by Ivanti. When I say hardened, we're not running Apache. We're not running SMTP. A lot of your default protocols and features that are baked into Linux have been disabled because A, we don't need them, and B, they could introduce a security threat. So we really are using a very stripped down version of CentOS. For those that care, most everything has been locked down except specifically the parts that are needed for communication. The purpose of the CSA is to allow communication of the agents while they're off the network. The agents will be configured by default to communicate with the Ivanti core server while on the company network. If for some reason they can't connect to the core server or resolve its name, then we're going to assume we're off network. And the clients have a secondary address that tells them, hey, if you can't reach the core server, then go ahead and connect to this public IP address. And of course, what we've got is we've got the appliance residing in your DMZ. It has a private IP address typically, right? Depending on how your DMZ is configured, I have seen customers that use the public address right in their DMZ, and that's fine too. But typically, the Cloud Service Appliance will be configured with a private IP address. You'll have a public host name. In my example, it's going to be mycsa.ventosi.com. And then that's, of course, going to resolve to a public IP address. The clients are going to communicate to the public IP address. It's going to forward the traffic to the Cloud Service Appliance. Now, there's a couple of things I want to point out. They're nuances, but I think they're important considerations, especially your security team. All client communication with the CSA is done over port 443. So we're using secure socket layer. Cloud Service Appliance has a certificate that allows it to respect the client certificate. And so without one, communication can't happen. So it is managed by the certificate. All communication is over port 443. Now I want you to pay special attention to the order of the arrows because this is really the significance here. These represent firewalls, right? This is the firewall to the public internet, and this is the firewall between your DMZ and your corporate network. The Cloud Service Appliance, for the most part, other than certain maintenance tasks, doesn't make connections. It receives connections, and that's an important distinction. Never will you need to configure any access from the DMZ to the core server. The core server will be configured to communicate with the Cloud Service Appliance, and it will make a connection to the appliance, and it's not vice versa. So it's an important distinction. The core server will connect to the Cloud Service Appliance. Clients, when they communicate with the core server, will make a connection to the Cloud Service Appliance. And then, of course, the purpose of the appliance is to bind the sessions together so they can communicate. Now, we do have an article on the community. I don't have a link to it right now, but if you were to search the community, the article is entitled Steps Taken to Harden the Cloud Service Appliance. It goes into a lot of detail about some of the security considerations. But one thing I'll tell you is no data is unencrypted on the appliance itself. Again, no data is stored here. No data is it's not even decrypted here. It is merely, think of it as an application level proxy. We communicate, the core server communicates. The core server actually is the guy that will unencrypt the communication. So just to kind of summarize, the client communication with the Cloud Service Appliance is over port 443. We're using SSL for authentication. Consider also that the inventory data that's being sent is not anything specific to the user. It is merely a hardware and software inventory of the device. There's no personal identifiable information on it. And likewise with the vulnerability scan will still be sending information pertaining to the vulnerabilities your device has. And again, although that is being transmitted, it's secure, it is encrypted, and that data will not be decrypted until the core server has it. So there's really some considerable security considerations. All communication from the core server to the CSA is over port 443, and likewise the clients communicate over 443. So the session is encrypted all the way until it is decrypted on the core server. We'll talk more about the network considerations here in just a little bit. But basically, now that we have the cloud service appliance, anytime the client is scheduled to do an inventory scan, anytime that it's scheduled to do a vulnerability scan, or maybe check for policies, policy sync runs, maybe using the portal, the client will try to reach the core server, and it will automatically make a connection to the cloud service appliance when it can't reach it. Now, it's important to kind of point out that the client only connects to the client for the most part. There's really two parts to the client, but the majority of the client does not maintain a persistent connection to the CSA. It connects briefly when it's scheduled through its local scheduler to do vulnerability scans and inventory scans. The one exception is the remote control agent. It will make a persistent connection to the cloud service appliance. So it's important to understand, I can initiate remote control directly to a device, whether it's on the internal network or on the cloud service appliance. And the cool thing is I don't even have to know if it's on the network or off. When I initiate remote control, the core server, likewise, will try to reach the device on the company network first. And if it can't reach it there, then it looks to the cloud service appliance to see if the device has a connection to it. If so, it binds the sessions. So the remote control agent does make a persistent connection. The clients, as far as the vulnerability scanner and inventory and policy sync, they connect as needed and disconnect. The reason I'm kind of making a point of that is all of our software patching, software distribution jobs will be policy-based. We won't be able to force the initiation immediately, but the clients will get the policy and begin patching or installing the software the next time they check in. This is the biggest part. This is the part, it's actually relatively simple, but it is your biggest bottleneck in provisioning and setting up a cloud service appliance. Obviously, before we can fully configure and test it, these network rules need to be in place. So this is a network diagram that shows the traffic. Of course, we've got the internet on the right with clients on the right, and we've got the core server on the left. And so when the core server makes a connection to the cloud service appliance, the reality is the only port it has to have access to is 443. FYI, this TCP 80 to the CSA is not required anymore. You can do it. There are certain things that you might, pages and whatnot that you'll want to pull up, but the reality is almost everything you need is through 443. You could do it, but notice the internet, from the public internet, we are only forwarding 443. Now the cloud service appliance itself does need to connect to the internet occasionally, but only for licensing purposes and patching. And so they will connect to Ivanti servers periodically. I think it's by default 90 days. And they'll need to be able to connect to it automatically in order to validate your license is current and that you're up to date. If for whatever reason the cloud service, just like your core server, it needs to reactivate every 90 days. If it can't find the internet, if we don't have a port open for it to connect, then when it tries, it'll give you a 30-day grace. But now we've reached 120 days since we last checked in. After that, the CSA will cease to function until it's been activated. Now, if you're in an environment where it's just not going to be possible for them to give you outbound access from the DMZ, we do have manual ways of handling activation that we'll talk about. But typically, we leave these ports open. We want the CSA to be able to initiate traffic over 443 and 80. Licensing uses 443 and patch download uses 80. Again, the main reasons are so we can activate. And when I say patch download, what I'm really referring to is patches for the CSA. We're not talking about patches that are being delivered or anything like that through Endpoint Manager. But what I'm specifically referring to is its ability to patch itself. We are constantly, as new versions of SSL and whatnot come out on Linux, we're constantly updating it to increase security as needed. The core server only needs to connect to the cloud service appliance over 443. As I said, 80 is optional. The core server has to connect to the cloud service appliance. Some companies don't restrict access from their internal company network to the DMZ. Many do, though. The core server will have to be allowed to connect to the cloud service appliance over a minimum of port 443. Anyone that's using a management console, you may have them locally installed on your workstations. You might have it advertised in Citrix, who knows? But wherever that management console is located, wherever it is run from, and if you think about it, even with Citrix, you're really running things from your desktop. It's streaming from the Citrix server. So in that case, it would usually be your desktop. If you're already pinged into a Citrix desktop, then it would be coming from there. But the point is, anyone with a management console, their console also needs to be able to connect to the cloud service appliance from the internal network. Remember, we're going to give the cloud service appliance a fully qualified domain name, and it's usually going to be, whatever you want to name it, and your public internet domain. In our case here, we're going to use vantasi.com, but the CSA will be called myCSA, just to keep things simple. I actually suggest you not use CSA in the host name, just to kind of keep things from being too identifiable, but it's up to you. But the reality is we're going to have a public, fully qualified name, mycsa.vantosi.com. From the internet on the external DNS servers, that will resolve to the public IP address that you've specified on your firewall. And then that public address, you'll have your port forwarding rules. You'll forward the traffic to the private address that the CSA has. But on your company network, we cannot, and we do not use different host names for internal connections versus external. You will need to use the same host name for the CSA in your internal network, but you'll want DNS to resolve to the private address. Any calls from your internal network to mycsa.vantosi.com would resolve to the private address on the CSA. We'd come here. Anything from the public will go to the public IP address. So that's pretty much all you need to have. These other things are optional. When if I think I might want to troubleshoot the cloud service appliance, then it would be useful to be able to putty into it so that I can access a terminal to troubleshoot Linux and things like that. And if that's the case, then we want to open port 22 from the core server to the CSA. We'd use a product like PuTTY or WinSCP to connect to Linux. That's purely optional. Likewise, and what I usually recommend when I'm initially setting it up, if the guys are willing, I'll say, go ahead and open it. Once I've got everything running, we can shut it down. Now, keep in mind, that would only be available internally because we're only forwarding 443 from the external internet. So the fact that we're allowing it really won't have any security ramifications. Likewise, from the cloud service appliance, we talk about the fact that it needs bidirectional on 443. It needs to receive and send, but we also want it to be able to connect outbound to the internet over 443 and 80. We may need one more port allowed, and that depends. If you've got a DNS server that's accessible from the DMZ that we can configure the cloud service appliance to use, then we don't need to consider an additional port out to the internet. If we don't, if we're just going to make use of our ISP or a public DNS server like Google, then we'll configure it to use the public addresses, and you'll need to open 53, TCP 53 outbound from the CSA to whatever DNS server you want to use. So now let's move right on to the installation of the cloud service appliance. One of the first things you really want to do, though, is make sure that you've got an appropriate license, that you're licensed to use the cloud service appliance, and to make sure that the licenses have been provisioned properly for you. I know we had an issue at one point where the license information wasn't correct. And so I want you to make sure you validate that your license is active and current. If not, you might as well stop and open a ticket with support before you go any further. And the way you can tell, remember, you should have activation credentials. These are what we use to activate our core server. It's a username and a password. And hopefully you have it. If not, you'll want to open a ticket with support, but you should have it. The portal.ivanti.com is our customer licensing portal, and you can log into it to verify your licenses. Now, consider again that this has nothing to do, we don't want to sign in with the community ID. The reality is, to get the most accurate, we want to use the username and password here that are actually your activation credentials. Now, once you log in and you enter your credentials, you'll see there is a tab down here for all entitlements and maintenances, and that's what you're going to click on. And you want to verify on the right that you do have. You can search by cloud. There's a whole bunch of licenses that could be in here. Some of these licenses obviously are not related to the Cloud Service Appliance because I've got a full license. But the important thing is the Ivanti Virtual Cloud Service Appliance. There's actually needs to be 2 entries. There needs to be an 11.0 version, and actually the one that's required is 10.0. You may also have an 11.0 license, but it's actually not required. As long as you see an Ivanti Virtual Cloud Services Appliance with a version of 10, then you know you're good to go. If you don't see it in here, then you want to open a ticket with support so that they can make sure the license is added appropriately. All right, so one of the first things we're going to want to do is download the Cloud Service Appliance file. Now, it's an OVA file. For those of you guys that know vSphere well, know that an OVA is a prepackaged virtual machine that you just upload directly to your vSphere. And it's a little more than just a VM in that it also includes configuration settings and other things that you would just import directly up. And I'm assuming you know how to configure vSphere. One other thing I want to mention is, and by the way, you're going to go to the community and you're going to log in and click on the downloads. You will have to be logged in because your current login name is tied to your entitlements. And if you're not a member of the community, this is an important thing you should do anyway, because it's a treasure trove of very useful information. You know, I work in professional services, but when I encounter an error and I'm working with a client, it's the first place I look. You know, we do this really well. But anyway, you're going to go to the login as yourself. You'll want to make sure that if you haven't registered, that when you do register, you use your corporate email address, because again, that's how they're going to tie you to the entitlements that your company owns. So if you haven't done that, be sure to register soon. You'll need to do that in order to download some products. And so we're going to click on the Downloads tab, and you're going to go to the Cloud Service Appliance link and download from there, or you can just click on this and it will start the download of the OVA. Now, we only officially support vSphere, but we only officially support installing or implementing the CSA on vSphere. We actually support the Cloud Service Appliance itself, regardless of what hypervisor you're running it on. So if you're so inclined and you like to use Zen or Hyper-V, you can do that too. You're going to be on your own when it comes to converting the image and implementing it. But once it boots up, then it's really transparent, and support will assist you in the actual product itself. Now, most of you probably know this, but if you want to use Hyper-V, there is a toolkit that you can easily use to convert this OVA, or actually to the VMDK, which is the disk files, to a VHD file that Hyper-V can read. And this is the article I actually used. You know, it's funny, for the purposes of this training, I'm actually running the Cloud Service Appliance and my course server on Hyper-V. So you'll see that it certainly is possible. And as I said, they won't support the conversion. They won't support how to install it on another hypervisor, but once it's up and running, they will support the CSA itself, regardless of the hypervisor. Some things you should have ready in advance. Remember, we need a fully qualified domain name, a host name that the CSA will be using. So, you know, for example, for me, it will be mycsa.vantosi.com. The public IP address that fully qualified host name resolves to. To actually configure the CSA itself, we'll want the private IP address, subnet mask, default gateway, and the DNS server. And just with some notes below, remember that FQDN resolves to the public, not the private. This is what the clients will connect to externally on external DNS servers. The fully qualified CSA host name should resolve to the public IP address. On your internal network, that same host name should resolve to the private IP address. And so we need the private IP, the subnet mask, etc. And as I mentioned before, if you don't have DNS server accessible within your DMZ, then you should also allow outbound traffic over port 53 so that it can resolve names and whatnot. All right, that's it. And just to toss along that, we're going to hop right on into the installation now. You'll see that I myself took my own advice and I've collected all that information. It'll come in handy later. We'll be able to copy and paste and not fumble around, but this is what I'm going to call my cloud service appliance. It's at mycsa.vantosi.com, and there's the rest of the information. Now, technically, if you don't have DNS enabled, if you don't have a DNS server that you can connect to internally, or for whatever reason, there's concerns with connecting it externally to a public DNS server, we do have host entries that we can add. I've got them here to use as an example. But again, if DNS is enabled, if DNS service is available, then these are all publicly registered names and IP addresses. So these host entries on the CSA won't be necessary. I've got them ready just in case. As you see, I'm running this in Hyper-V. Just to tell you what we got going on here in our lab environment, I have a core server that we'll be utilizing. And I also have the CSA itself. Take a look at both of those. I've uploaded the VM. I've converted it to a VHD, but that's again up to you. But it's ready for me to start the cloud service appliance. So we're going to go ahead. We've got it mounted. We're ready to go, and we're going to start it up. Notice it is a Linux box. So there we go. As we expect, while it's booting up, we're going to see a lot of Linux. This is all very typical. There will be some initial failures and whatnot. That's normal. We haven't configured it with an IP address, for example, yet. So it doesn't, it can't initialize the interface, but we'll get there. All right, but this is what it's going to look like. Now, one of the things I want to again emphasize throughout this training is the quick start guide. The quick start guide is going to have everything you need, and I tried to make it so that you could use this independent of this training, but we'll still be referencing it quite a bit. And so you'll see the username and password is in your documentation. The username is admin, and the password out of the box is also admin. Now, you're going to log in for the first time, and of course, the first thing it's going to want to ask you to do is accept the EULA and then change that password. Scroll down to the bottom and click accept. Of course, now the next thing it wants you to do is create a new default password. You know, it has to be a strong password. It has to be at least 8 characters long. We need to have upper and lowercase letters, one of each at least, a number and a symbol. All of those have to be true. I'll go ahead and enter my super secret complicated password here. Make sure you make a note of it. There is absolutely no way to recover a lost admin password. Now, I'll give you some suggestions on how to protect yourselves, but if you lose this password, there's nothing support can do. The root account is disabled by default. All right, and so you can't connect via root. You have to know the admin password, so make sure you write it down and protect it. All right, now that license agreement is there from before. You don't need to click on it again. So now the first thing we need to do is configure the network itself, the network connection. So we're going to click over here on System. Again, following the steps in the documentation, I'm in Eastern Standard Time. By the way, that's a long list. Shortcut is just to type in your time zone and it'll take you there. Otherwise, you'll be scrolling all around. So I'm in Eastern Standard Time, and right now it is noon, 12:02. Make sure the date time's right and save it. Each time you make a save in this interface, you should see a green confirmation above. So make sure you watch for that. Sometimes, depending on what it's doing, it could be taking a while to refresh. That's because behind the scenes, if we were looking at the terminal, Linux is reconfiguring itself and whatnot. So wait to move on to the next screen until you've gotten a confirmation. So this is where we're going to configure our Ethernet. There is some sample data in here that's of no use to us. We'll go ahead and remove it. It was meant to be examples. And again, remember, this is why I have this sheet that I've got all configured here. So remember, we're going to configure the cloud service appliance to use our private address because that's how it's going to communicate in your DMZ. Subnet mask, my network. Yours might be different. And the gateway address. Make sure you hit add. We only have one NIC. There is, it has a drop down, but the reality is we're using a single NIC configuration. Under DNS, we want to put our DNS servers. I'm just using Google for the purpose of this training, but you could put in your own if you have, again, one in the DMZ. You'll plug that in there, and if it's going to be external, you'll plug in the external one, either the one your ISP gave you or a public one. And now this part's important. So we're going to put just the host name here and the domain name here. Now certificates are built with the fully qualified domain name of the CSA. So you kind of want to get this right the first time, otherwise you'll have to delete the certificates and start over so that they get created if you decide to change the name that you wanted to use. Obviously, that you should never do that once it's implemented because clients will be looking for the certificate to match what's in the client. But initially setting it up, you want to make sure that the first time you rename it, that you rename it what you're going to want. Otherwise, there's additional steps that you'll need to take to remove the certificate. We're waiting for it. It's posting, and we should be able to communicate with it as soon as it's done. All right. Okay. Next step, we're just following the checklist here, and we're going to scroll down and click on the host names tab. This, the only thing that really has to be in here is the IP address of your core server. So it's going to be 172.23.11.48. All right, there's the core server. We're going to type in the DNS name and the host name. And really, again, these are host entries, so they're going to be the same. We're going to add the core server. Now, for my purposes, again, I don't have a functional DNS server, so I'm going to go ahead and put in the host entries. These are optional for you. We need to be able to connect to the to the Ivanti licensing service, and we also needed to be able to connect to the patching servers to pull down patches for the cloud service appliance. Like I said, you may not need this. If you don't need it, don't use it. Because you never know, down the road, they may have to change IP addresses or something, and then you'd have it hard-coded here. Whereas if you're using DNS, it'll update automatically. We're just going to add license. And these are, again, in your document, your quick start guide, the actual ones that we want in here. One more. All right, make sure you hit save. Now the host file has been updated. Okay, next, we want to check for updates. So we're going to click scan for updates. I can't really demonstrate this because I've already applied all the updates, but you're going to click on scan for updates. I do have a screenshot of when I did it previously. So this is what you're going to see. When you scan for updates, you'll show any patches that are available. and just click apply. All right, we've applied all our updates. Now we need to configure the gateway service. This is where we're going to specify additional host names. This, again, we've really focused on security here as far as the cloud service appliance is concerned. And so we want to make sure that there's no redirections or anything nefarious going on. It will only reply to commands sent to mycsa.ventosi.com. Again, without getting too technical, it's potentially possible somebody could put in a host entry or something that says CSA.ventosi.com and it resolves to the same IP address. It wouldn't allow that connection. It only will allow connections for people looking for one of these host names. And typically I'll put in the host names and I'll also put in the IP address, both the internal and external IP addresses. All right. The qualified domain name of the cloud service appliance, the private IP address, and the public. Notice it's space delimited, space separated listed, and click save. Not always readily apparent. There we are. Gateway settings are updated. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to tweak the firewall a little. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go into too much detail what this is all about. The reality is most of these settings are only applicable if you're placing this in a public internet environment where you don't have a protective firewall around it and whatnot. The reality is this guy is existing in your DMZ typically. You're only forwarding port 443. So a lot of the inherent vulnerabilities are remediated by that. And so we could certainly block specific IP addresses from connecting to the CSA. And likewise, we could use a whitelist to only allow connections from specific IP addresses. But really, that's a bit unnecessary for our purposes. Again, what I'll say is some environments require a much more locked down cloud service appliance. As I said, maybe you're placing it on the public internet or whatnot. And so these will be important. We're just trying to make this a very simple setup for you as far as this training video, understanding, as I said at the beginning, that not everything will be enabled, mobility and other things. And the security is rather simplistic for now. Just know that you can enable a firewall. You can add all kinds of additional security factors. But I want to make this as simple as possible for you just to get your cloud service appliance up and running. Of course, feel free to talk to support or engage with professional services if you have questions about hardening this down a little bit. We need to allow traffic over. We don't need to worry about the 80. And that's really not needed anymore. But 443, this is the device's firewall. I'm not going to enable it for now, again, because I feel it's pretty much unnecessary. If you have this sitting in a DMZ, and if you're only forwarding 443, then none of the rest of this really matters. Just remember that if you do want to have the ability to putty in, we talked about that. If you want to make an SSH connection, then that will matter, and you'll enable it here. Again, your network has to allow port 22 from your internal network to the public or to the CSA. At the end of the day, we really just want to remove all blocked addresses and allowed addresses and make sure that we've got HTTPS enabled. Again, you could choose to disable the firewall if you like, because again, it's really mainly needed if you're going to be placing this box somewhere where we're going to be counting on the OS firewall more than a hardware firewall. That's pretty much it for all the settings. The only thing that's left to do now is activate our cloud service appliance. Now remember, activation of the cloud service appliance does require outbound internet connectivity. DNS needs to be working, etc. If any of these are blocked, then we will not be able to activate online. Just know that it is possible also to activate it offline. But we'll take a look at both methods. All right, like as I said, you'll have your own activation credentials that you would have previously used to activate your core server. I'm using my own. In this place, you would put your activation credentials that you use to activate your core server. Again, if you've misplaced them for some reason, you can always open a ticket and they'll provide you with your credentials once you've verified your identity. We're going to type in our credentials and we're going to click Activate Online. There you go. So if it activated successfully, like I said before, this is a real good stress test to make sure you've got network connectivity and whatnot between patching and license activation. You validated that you have the outbound ports necessary. Now, if for some reason you don't have internet access, it will fail to connect. It'll advise you that it couldn't connect to the server because perhaps you're not going to allow that outbound access. And it would say failed to connect, and it'll give you the option to activate by email. I'm not going to really demonstrate this, but basically all it's going to do, when you click activate by email, it's going to have you download a little file. You're going to attach that, and it will also give you these instructions, by the way. You'll attach that file to an email message and send it to licensing@landesk.com. You'll receive a reply back that you'll in turn import. We're just going to leave it at that. Again, we have an article on the community if you need to manually activate offline. But we're all set. We're activated, we're online, we're patched, we've got all the connectivity information. So that's going to be it on configuring the cloud service appliance. Now we're going to be ready to hop on over to the core server. So here we are back on our core server. Now up to this point, all of the configuration that we've done with the cloud service appliance have been through the hypervisor. Of course, we had to get it on the network before we could communicate with it. So we had to do that through the hypervisor, either using a console in vSphere or terminal in Hyper-V. But from this point on, we can do all of our management of the cloud service appliance through the web interface. So we're going to type in the name of the cloud service appliance in a web browser, and we're going to add /GSV. And this is outlined for you in the quick start guide, but that is the login interface for the cloud service appliance. Now remember, I told you that we're going to need to know that admin password. That's where we're going to use it. Here in another area, this is where you're going to use the admin password. Look at this. It's just like the view that we saw. And from this point on, we can actually manage and connect through this web interface. The good news is, once you connect to the interface through a web browser, well, it's using port 443. This is HTTPS. Remember, all communication with the cloud service appliance, both from the core server and from the public internet, is over 443. So if I can connect through this, then I know that all of my routing rules are good. There's two things you can do to quickly test those routing rules. If you are off the company network, you can browse this. It should resolve to the fully qualified public IP address, the public domain name, the public IP address. If you receive a prompt to log in, just like I did, you don't need to actually log in. But if you get the prompt, the challenge, the certificate warning from a device that's not connected at all to the company network, that means our forwarding rules are working on the public side as well. Pretty much, if you can connect to this web interface, both from the internal network and from the public internet, you know that all the communication that you're going to need to make this work is functional. So it's a great thing before we even start configuring anything, we know that the communication is working. Okay, now we're going to tell the core server how to use the CSA where it's located. And we're going to click on Configure, Manage Cloud Service Appliances. Not everybody has a cloud service appliance, so of course there's nothing pre-configured here. It's up to you to configure it all. So We're going to go back here. We're going to say, all right, the CSA public name is going to be the same as the CSA private name. If for some reason you are using a public IP address to connect to the CSA, then you won't need to do the internal, because both internally and externally, we're going to connect to the public IP. And this is our admin password. Notice it doesn't ask you for the username. It assumes you're using admin. So this is, you'll type in the admin password that you created when you first logged into the CSA. Now, if you have a public IP address, if you're not hosting it in your DMZ, maybe you've got it in the cloud or something, or off-site, then this is all you'll need. Assuming it's in your DMZ, though, we'll also want to put the private IP address in here so that the core server knows how to connect to it. And up here, I put the private, I meant to put the public. This is the qualified domain name, public IP address, the admin password. We're going to use the same fully qualified domain name internally, and that will resolve to the private IP address. If all goes well, now we're going to click apply, and it will post the certificate. Now, it will give you a warning here. It's telling you, hey, you're using a self-signed certificate. For the very best security, we do offer the option of using a third-party signed certificate that you would get from VeriSign or GoDaddy or whatever your provider is. So you can replace the self-signed certificate with a fully trusted certificate. Again, for the purposes of this training, there's really no issue leaving the self-signed certificate in place. Remember, the clients are going to have a matching certificate that goes with it. So there's really no harm. All right, and we know that we have successfully connected the core server to the cloud service appliance because it's posted here. Now, when you save it, it's going to want to restart the broker service, and you should say yes. The broker service is that service on the core server that makes the persistent connection to the cloud service appliance. All right, the core server knows how to connect to the cloud service appliance. Now we need the agents to know how. This is actually handled through an agent setting called client connectivity settings. Now remember, these settings may already be applied to your workstation. The client connectivity setting specifically is what tells the devices that there's a CSA available for them to use. Now, if you've already deployed your agents, they're going to have these connectivity settings, but they're not going to have information on the CSA. That kind of falls back to where we started with this when we started talking about a couple of the challenges. If you're setting it up for the first time and you haven't even rolled out your agents, or your agents are on the internal network most of the time, then this should just dynamically update the next time a security scan happens. If they're off the network, though, it can never get these updated settings, so it doesn't know to use the CSA. This is what tells it, hey, if you can't reach the core server, try this. Okay, so that's why I said, really, the best way would be, of course, if they are connecting, but if you are in a more of a critical situation, then the only option is to create a self-contained agent after you've configured these connectivity settings, and they'll have to reinstall the agent, assuming they have local admin rights. This is it. We're going to enable the cloud service appliance CSA communication. We're going to say, here is the cloud service appliance you should communicate from. Now, one thing I'll mention is that Ivanti support recommends that you have no more than about 3,000 connected devices assigned to a specific CSA. Now, again, that's not to say that if you have 3,000 nodes in your entire database, in your entire core server, you need more than one CSA, but you really just need to figure out what you estimate concurrent connectivity being. If you've got more than 3,000 people that are always external, then you want to consider scaling a little bit. As I said, the CSA it'll actually go higher, but for best practices, in a pinch, if it goes a little higher, it's not going to hurt anything. You wouldn't want to try to intentionally run at a higher usage because eventually you may receive some out of, and all the ports are in use or whatnot. But if you did have more than one cloud service appliance, you would configure them all on the core server, and a device can have choices of multiple CSAs, or maybe the agent configuration will be specific for users to go to one CSA, while a different agent configuration points them to the other. We can also specify just multiples. We can say use it in the order that it's shown, or you can say use a random order to kind of just load balance it. This is all only applicable if you have multiple cloud service appliances. But if you are adding multiple cloud service appliances, this entire process up to this point is still applicable. You're going to configure the cloud service appliance. It's going to have obviously a different public IP address, a different public host name, and you're just going to go into the server, the core server, and add them to the workstation or to the client connectivity settings that are appropriate for the devices that may connect to the cloud service appliance. And remember, you could also go in here and you can enter multiple cloud service appliances. Once they're in that list, then and only then will they appear as an option in this list. That's really the biggest consideration. Now, there's a couple of more settings that I think would be beneficial. We talked about the client connectivity settings. Now, we're going to quickly talk about remote control. I'm kind of jumping ahead, but there's a purpose for this. As I mentioned before, we have a new remote control tool, and it's the latest, greatest. We also have previous versions of the remote control tool. The newest, latest, greatest remote control tool, the very latest remote control tool, cannot natively communicate through the cloud service appliance. There's more that needs to be done to use the latest, greatest tool. It's going to involve installing a remote control tunnel service on a Linux device, maybe on the cloud service appliance, and installing the components for the tunnel on the core server as well. For our purposes, in the interest of simplicity, we are going to use the legacy so that you don't have to set up a remote control tunnel. But in order to do that, you're going to enable, this normally would not be selected, you're going to go to Configure, Legacy RC Configuration. You're going to enable some of these legacy tools. Now, some of you may be using them already. There's other reasons why you may choose to use them. But usually, our default workstation agent is not going to have that enabled. So you want to double check your remote control agent 2 and make sure that it allows you to use HTML remote control. If that's not on by default, we need to make sure that setting gets updated as well. Again, any settings we change will be dynamically updated the next time they send a vulnerability scan, or we can include it in a self-contained executable. But we need to make sure that whatever remote control settings they have, they allow HTML remote control. Okay, all that's left now is testing agent functionality. So we've taken our device again, and we have run a vulnerability scan while it's still on the company network so that it gets the updated settings. And then you're going to want to go ahead and move it on over to a Wi-Fi hotspot. Now, one other thing we're going to do just to cheat, to speed things up a little bit, and that is once you're connected to the Wi-Fi hotspot, stop and restart the LAN desk remote control service on that device. And we're doing that because anytime an IP address changes and the OS detects that an IP address change at a random time within the next 5 to 15 minutes, it will reset the remote control service to make sure it doesn't need to be using the cloud service appliance. This happens dynamically under normal circumstances. We're going to force it just to speed the process up for our testing. So you're going to connect your other device to your Wi-Fi hotspot, and then you're going to log in and You're going to restart the LAN desk remote control service on that device, and we'll be good to go. Now, to remote control, as I was saying, we are utilizing HTML remote control. And one last time, this is a legacy tool. We felt that we wanted to give you the ability to get this thing implemented as easily and quickly as possible. Our goal here is to give you everything you need to do this yourself. So we have foregone some of the additional security that would be typical in a production environment if we were to do the implementation for you. So there's certainly additional hardening that you can do. Installing the remote control tunnel on the cloud service appliance would allow you to not use legacy, and you could just use the new remote control tool. But for now, in the sake of making this relatively simple, you're going to utilize HTML remote control. Now, I would also mention that HTML remote control can be used internally and externally. So if you have to choose a single one to use, you can use this until you get a remote control tunnel built and implemented. Once you get the remote control built and implemented, the remote control tunnel, you can go back in here and disable the legacy, and now you'll only have the one option. But as I said, for the CSA purposes, we don't have to set up the entire remote control tunnel. We're just going to disable that temporarily. And now you'll have the HTML remote control. All right, so to initiate remote control, we're just going to right-click and say HTML legacy remote control. That will establish a connection to the device. Now, you don't need to know if it's on network or off. If you use HTML remote control, it will automatically determine whether to connect to the CSA or whether to connect to the device directly on your network. So it's seamless. Now, the one thing I like to do, we have connectivity. Obviously, our CSA is working for the most part. We can remote control through it. The last thing to validate is that the client can connect and send inventory and vulnerability scans to the core server. And the easiest, you could run an inventory scan or a security scan. It doesn't matter. I like to run a security scan as a test because it updates much more quickly and verbose. The bottom line is if you get to the third or the fourth done, you know that you've got good communication, and that from this point on, it behaves just like the normal vulnerability scan going directly to the core. It's just being sent to through the CSA instead. If you could do a vulnerability scan on the device, and if you can remote control it, then you've succeeded and you have a fully functional cloud service appliance. So that's it. We've accomplished what we wanted. We've talked about how to install and configure the cloud service appliance, how to connect the core server to it so that it can communicate back and forth, how to configure the agents to use the cloud service appliance, and how to update the agents once you've reconfigured them, and then how to validate and test functionality through the cloud service appliance. We hope that this guide and this training video is going to give you everything you need, but of course we encourage you to reach out to Ivanti support if you have any questions or if you run into any issues. You can also reach out to your Ivanti sales representative, and they can also engage professional services to help you. So thank you and have a great day.